So on top of all of the NWSL free agency comings and goings, Friday, also a date we've had circled on our NWSL calendars. What do we need to be on the lookout for come Friday evening here in the USA?
The NWSL Draft is happening 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific on January 12th. It's going to be televised in the US of A on the ION network, which recently acquired the rights to broadcast 25 Saturday night doubleheaders and the draft in the NWSL's landmark media rights deal that we talked about a few episodes ago. Mm-hmm. Here's the part where the Into the Channel podcast always promises not to lie to the people. I am not an expert in the draft. I am not an expert in collegiate American women's football. However, I would like to point the listeners to a couple cool resources that I found on the internet. Chris Henderson, he is at Chris, C-H-R-I-S, _Awk, A-W-K, on Twitter. He covers Division I women's collegiate football, and he has created, right there on his Twitter profile, he has a link to an online spreadsheet with prospects and their listed stats by position. Shout out to you, Chris. It is a very cool database. He has in-depth analytics on there. This dude is putting in work. So, Chris, I hope you become a friend of the pod. We're going to be looking at your stuff. Maybe you come on here and chat with us. Tell us how some of these players actually looked in college. Because I'd be really interested to hear it.
Shout out to Chris. He also had some tiers there that I found very helpful.
Exactly.
I'm getting pumped for this draft on Friday.
Yeah, man. Super cool. Really in-depth the way he did it. Very awesome work. The second resource I found that I really liked, it's a website. It's called the Soccer Dossier. It's committed to providing fans with information on the NWSL draft prospects. They did a mock draft in November where they used like a few beat writers of some of the clubs on like who would you pick. I would check that out if you're looking for people who have actual expertise on the draft. But what I want to ask you, Dino, is do you think the drafting of collegiate players is sustainable in the NWSL? I think it's interesting when you mentioned how playoffs are like a very American thing. I think the draft is a very American thing as well.
Hell yeah.
And so we talk about other countries, quote unquote, catching up to the USA in women's football. And one of those advantages that we've talked about that the other countries have, that established infrastructure of academies. According to some of my research, and some of this stuff is a little harder to find, so please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but I think fewer than half of the NWSL teams have academies right now. And I wonder how quickly that might change with the new wave of investment in the league. So I'll go back to the question. Are we going to be drafting forever, or do we eventually start to slide over to that kind of academy model that you see over in Europe and other countries?
It's interesting. I think it's ultimately an economics question. So clubs outside the US run academies because it's good business. I think about, like on the men's side, my squad, the Arsenal, they welcome a young Bukayo Saka to the academy at 7 years old.
That's amazing.
On the open market, Saka would fetch like a 9-figure price tag easily. We're talking like, I don't know, 150, 170. And just what he means to Arsenal, it might even be more than that. There's obviously merit to cultivating your own players internally, having the opportunity to reinvest in your players through the academy. So that $200 million that you don't have to go out and spend to get a Bukayo Saka, that could just essentially be reinvested into an academy in the program and just kind of expanding it even farther out geographically. But the draft, like you mentioned, incredibly American. I don't think it's ever really going to go away. The college program is a feeder system to the league, but I just don't think it'll continue to be the feeder system to the league. And now that you've had like an Alyssa Thompson go first in the draft, who bypasses college altogether, you also got San Diego's Melanie Barcenas, who got minutes last year for the Wave at 15 years old. It should be pretty well understood that stakes are only going to get higher. Younger players are going to be able to contribute earlier. In some cases, they can contribute right now. And all of this sort of breaks the idea of the draft as the primary mode of player acquisition. And then you add to that the NWSL maybe now has to buy more and more talent from other leagues as the growth of the women's game continues to accelerate around the world. That could get real expensive real quick, even with the new media rights deal. What happens when Liga F gets like a big ass media deal, or, D1F or from Bundesliga, like those are coming. They're absolutely coming. And that's only going to push prices higher. Things are going to get more expensive. We're going to have to find a way to build more value into players at younger ages.
I think it's a really good point. And even on Reddit, I think when they announced the NWSL media rights deal, it was like, this is the biggest media rights deal for a women's league ever. Like 2 or 3 of the first few comments were from football fans over in England. And they said, for now, until the WSL's deal.
Yep.
They feel like they need to be a direct competitor of us. And I think it's reasonable to believe also that the college pool of players could start to get plucked by other leagues as well. So how could that be the NWSL's only feeder system? I know when we did our World Cup coverage, we talked about Khadijah Bunny Shaw out of Jamaica, who now plays for Manchester City Football Club, scoring like 20 goals a year. She played at the University of Tennessee. International clubs were looking at those players as well. But I want to talk about, speaking of these college players, let's talk about the success rate of these number 1 picks in the NWSL draft. I'm going to read you the names of the players who have been selected number 1 overall from 2016. So in 2016, the aforementioned Emily Sonnet for the Portland Thorns. Next, in 2017, the aforementioned Rose Lavelle, picked number 1 overall. In 2018, Andy Sullivan, also a good player. 2019, Tierna Davidson. It sounds like we have the Gotham FC All-Stars here. 2020, Sophia Smith. 2021, Emily Fox. 2022, Naomi Girma. And 2023, Alyssa Thompson. And so for any of our international listeners, who might not fancy a lot of American sports, in professional American football, in professional basketball in the United States, the number 1 overall picks do not look like that year over year. You are bound to pick a player who is going to really disappoint you. And so to kind of look at these players, and I wonder if it's a function of, these players have a lot of tape in college, or maybe the pool is a little smaller of who you would consider picking number 1. But that is an incredibly high success rate for getting good players at number 1 in the draft. I just thought that was a really interesting piece of info there.
Yeah, I mean, couple juicy points there. One, what's to stop a Chelsea or a Barcelona from just plucking the number 1 pick in the 2025 draft a year early and just being like, here's a big check, come play with us.
Sure.
The draft, growing up, we thought about it as more of like a baseball, football, NBA vehicle, right?
Yep.
And neither of those leagues, I mean, baseball had to compete with Japan, I guess.
Sure.
Football and basketball, there was no competition. The pathway was very linear.
Yeah.
You're great in high school, great in college, and the pros is just one league encompassed here in the USA. I think there will always be a place for the draft for players raising their hand and saying, hey, I want to be considered to be selected.
Yeah.
But it won't be the only way that players move or enter the league. There's just going to have to be some evolution there. NWSL probably just going to have to follow suit with what's happening globally, just because, Barcelona could wire a check, into a University of Tennessee volunteer student bank account just the same. They can sign a contract. Nothing stopping them from doing that.
Yep.
Either way, I'm pretty pumped for Friday night. And speaking of the bridging of the gap between USA and Europe, we also had some interesting news with regard to one of the teams that we've been tracking pretty closely as part of our UEFA Women's Champions League coverage. Barcelona head coach. We had some movement there. What do we need to know about this?